Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about factoring trinomials, which is a really helpful skill to have. In Algebra 1, we're going to need it later to help us solve quadratic equations, but in higher mathematics, it's used a lot, so it's a really nice skill to have, and we're going to factor using the diamond method, and we're going to do a little bit of review as well. So starting off with that review. So what we did first was we were multiplying polynomials. So what we did is we took these factors. We had these two factors that we multiplied together to get a product. And the way that we did that was we created a box and we took our first binomial and we split the terms across the top. So I had 2x over one column and then my positive 2 over the other column. And then we took the second binomial, and that's 4x as its first term, and then its second term in the second row was minus 1. And so how we just did this is we looked at our individual boxes and we multiplied what was up on top by what was over to the side. So the first box, we get 2 times 4 is 8, and x times x is x squared, so we get 8x squared. When I move over to the second box, I get 4 times 2 is 8 times x, so 1x, so I get 8 times x is 8x. And the lower box, I have negative 1 times 2x, so negative 1 times 2 is negative 2 times x is negative 2x, and then I get negative 1 times positive 2 is negative 2. So we filled out all of those boxes, and then we looked for like terms. So I've got two boxes here that have x to the power of 1, right? This 8x and this negative 2x, so those right there. And we would combine those together, so I can just add my coefficients. So negative 2 plus 8 gives me 6, so that's going to become 6x. And then I just write it all out, right? I get 8x squared, and then plus my 6x, and then minus 2. Let me see if I can actually move this down a little bit so that we can see that better. So I've got 8x squared plus 6x minus 2. So this is a skill we've already done. Why we did a quick review on it is because when we're multiplying polynomials, we take factor times factor to get a product. When we're factoring trinomials, now we're taking the product and we want to figure out what those factors are. So we're going backwards now. So now we want to start with the product and we want to figure out what those two binomials are. All right. So last week, another kind of review thing, we worked on diamond puzzles, and that's where we had two different numbers on the sides. We had number 1 and number 2, and then the very top was the product of that. So number 1 times number 2, and the bottom was number 1 plus number 2. So there's kind of a quick review, looking at how that looked like with numbers. If I had 3 and 10, my top is going to be 3 times 10, which is 30, right? And the bottom is going to be 3 plus 10, which is 13. So those are the two review things that we kind of need to move ahead for factoring trinomials. And we're just going to go ahead and get to it. So let's talk about our steps to factoring. So the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to label A, B, and C when we get our trinomial. So A, B, and C, these are all going to be coefficients or parts of our trinomial. All right. And then we're going to take A and we're going to multiply it by C, and that's going to go in the very top of our diamond puzzle. And then we're going to take B and we're going to put it in the bottom of our diamond puzzle. And then we have to solve our diamond puzzle. So then we're going to come up and figure out what those two sides are. Once we solve those two sides, we're going to divide those by A, and sometimes we'll have to reduce. It'll give us a fraction that maybe we have to reduce. Okay, and then we're going to write our binomials off of those numbers. And the thing to remember when writing the binomials is the phrase bottoms up. So we're going to take with the bottom first. That's going to become what's going to get attached to our x. So if you want to pause this and take notes on our different steps, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different steps so that you have access to them. You can do it. It's a good time to pause. Right. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and move ahead and see what those steps actually look like. So we're going to start with this one. I have 8ax squared plus bx plus c. This is the standard form for trinomials. So this is how we're going to identify a, b, and c. So a, b, and c are actually going to be numbers in your trinomial instead of the letters. And it's really important to note that a is always the coefficient to the x squared term. So a right here is going to always be matched with the square. All right. B is always going to be matched with the power of 1. So remember, we don't write those power of 1s, but it's always going to be the coefficient on the variable that doesn't have an exponent. And then C, if you notice, there's no x at all. So C is our constant term. And ideally, we would have it written for us in this format with the x squared first, and then the x to the power of 1, and then that constant number. But sometimes they get mixed up. So we got to pay close attention to make sure that we're identifying A, B, and C correctly. All right, so let's just go ahead and take a look. This is the normal way. So we get the squared term first, and then the power of 1, and then our constant. So the coefficient on the square, that is going to be my A. So A is going to equal 4. The coefficient on the power to 1 is 2. So B is going to be equal to 2. And then our constant term is going to be 5. So A equals 4, B equals 2, and C equals 5. But again, it's not always quite as simple. So if we look at our next one here, you notice our squared term's kind of in the middle now. So just take a moment, see if you can figure out what's A, what's B, and what's C. And so this time A is actually 7, because remember A is always the coefficient on the term that's squared. And B is our 3, because it's just the x to the power 1. And then C is 12. So we're going to do one more. This one's actually a binomial, not a trinomial, and it has 2 terms. But when we look at it, there's a couple tricks on this one. So try to think of what could be A, what could be B, and what could be C. So remember, A is always our coefficient on the square. So that means it's going to be our coefficient by that x, right? Which it's not written, which means it's a 1. So A equals 1. In this case, we don't have an x to the power of 1. There's no x with no exponents there. So that means B actually equals 0 because there's no term with just x to the power of 1. So B and C could possibly both be 0. We could have, if our constant term is missing, C is 0. And if the x term is missing, then B is 0. So, and then our constant term here is -4. So in this case, C equals -4. All right, so that's identifying A, B, and C. That's always going to be our first step. So when we look at how we're going to factor these trinomials, so I'm going to start with 6x squared plus 11x plus 4. So remember, our first step is always to identify A, B, and C. So A is going to be the power to 2, right? B is going to be the coefficient of the power to 1, and C is going to be the no variable. So when we look at that, I'm just going to go ahead and identify A, B, and C. So I'm going to move to step 2, right? And step 2 was to multiply A and C together, and we're going to put that in the top of our diamond puzzle. So 6 times 4, right? A times C, we're going to do 6 times 4 is 24, and that's going to go right in the top of our diamond puzzle. And then we're going to take our B, which is 11, and that's going to go into the bottom of our diamond puzzle. So putting B equals 11. So now we're on to our third step, which is solving this diamond puzzle. So remember, we have to find those numbers that when we multiply, they're going to be 24, but when we add them, they're going to be 11. All right, so I'm looking to find all my factors of 24, and I'm going to look for those factors that add up to be 11. Since 24 is positive, I could have either both positive factors or I could have both negative factors. So I'm going to try it both ways. So I could take 1 times 24, and if I add those together, I get 25. All right, so that's not the answer we're looking for because we want to add for 11. Or I could do -1 times -24, and when we add them, we get -25. Or I could do 2 times 12, but if I add those, I get 14. Right? Or we could do -2 times -12. Again, if I add those, it's going to be -14, so still not there. And then I can do 3 times 8, and when I add those, those are 11. So that's our solution, right? We're going to have 3 and 8. So I'm going to write 3 and 8 in my sides because that's solving the diamond puzzle. So I'm going to take those 3 times 8. Okay. And then next up, I'm going to have to divide the next step, right? We need to divide those by our A term. So A is, our coefficient on the A term is 6. So I need to divide both of those by 6. And then I'm going to reduce if I can. And actually, both of these can be reduced. So 3, 6, I can divide both of those by 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1, and 6 divided by 3 is 2. So that's going to reduce down to 1/2, right? And 8, 6, I can divide both of those by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. So then I just reduce those. So now I'm going to go to my next step, and that's going to be to write the binomials. And here's how it's going to work. So remember, writing binomials, we're going to take bottoms up. So I'm going to look at the left side, really quick, is 1/2. So I'm going to take that 2 first. So bottoms up, right? 2 first. So that's going to be 2x. And then I'm going to take the top second, and that's going to be positive 1. So I'm going to get 2x plus 1, and that becomes my first binomial, 2x plus 1. And then I'm going to look over at the second side, again, bottoms up. So bottom goes first, so that's 3. I'm going to put the x on it, so I'm going to get 3x. And then the top of it was positive 4, so I'm going to get 3x plus 4. And so that's factored. This trinomial is now factored. I get the 2x plus 1 times 3x plus 4. All right, let's go ahead and do another example. So this time we have 2x squared minus x minus 10. So again, our step 1 is to identify A, B, and C. So go ahead and look at those and see what A, B, and C would be, what you think they would be. And we get A equals 2, B equals negative 1. Don't forget about your invisible ones. And C equals negative 10. So now I'm going to take, my next step is to take A times C. So I'm going to take 2 times negative 10, and that gives me negative 20, and that goes in the top of my diamond. A times C equals negative 20. Then I'm going to take my B, which is negative 1, and that goes in the bottom. And now I'm going to solve my diamond puzzle. So what we're going to do, we're looking for factors of negative 20 that add together to be negative 1. So I'm looking at negative 20. Since it's negative, one factor has to be positive and one has to be negative. So I'm going to switch them up. So I've got different possibilities. I could do negative 1 times 20. And if I add those together, I get 19. Or I could do 1 times negative 20, which if I add those together, I'm going to get negative 19. So neither of those are my solution. Or I could do negative 2 times 10 and end up with positive 8 if I add them together. Or I can do 2 times negative 10 and end up with negative 8 if I add them together. Or I can do negative 4 times 5, and then I end up with a positive 1. It's still not a negative 1. Or I can switch those, and I can do 4 times negative 5, and now I'm going to add them together to get negative 1. So that's going to be my solution. So I'm going to have 4, and I'm going to have negative 5 on my sides. So the next step after we've solved this puzzle is now to divide each term by 2. So on each of those sides, I'm going to divide by 2 because that's my A term. And then I'm going to reduce if I need to. So 4 halves reduces, right? 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. Negative 5 halves doesn't reduce, so it's just going to stay just like it is. And now I'm going to do bottoms up and write my binomials. So I'm looking at the left, and it's 1 first. I'm going to pull that 1 up. So I'm going to get 1x, which we're just going to write as x because we don't write coefficients of 1. So I've got 1x plus 2, which is actually x plus 2. Then I'm going to look over at the right and bottoms up. So I'm going to pull the 2 first, and that's going to be 2x minus 5. Since that 5 is negative, it's going to get 2x minus 5. And that's that trinomial factored. So 2x squared minus x minus 10 factors to x plus 2 times 2x minus 5. All right, so one more example just to show you. So now we have x squared minus 16. So again, our first step is to identify A, B, and C. So I'm going to take a look at that, see if you can figure out what is what. Obviously, we're missing one of them because there's only 2 terms up there. So A goes with the square, so A is going to be 1, so don't forget our invisible ones, right? And there's no B term because we have no x to the power of 1. So there's no B term, so B is going to be 0 in this case. And our C is going to be negative 16. So our next step is to take our coefficient of A times our coefficient of the C. So I'm doing 1 times negative 16, and that is negative 16, so that's going to be put in the top of our diamond puzzle. And then we're going to take our B term, which B is actually 0, and that goes in the bottom. So B equals 0. So now I'm going to solve this puzzle. So now I'm looking for factors of negative 16 that are going to add to equal 0. So I'm going to go ahead and look at my factors. So I can do a negative 1 times 16. That's going to give me a positive 15 if I add them together. Or I could do 1 times negative 16, which gives me a negative 15. Or I can do negative 2 times 8, right? Which if I add those together, I get 6. Or I can do 2 times negative 8. If I add those, I get negative 6. Negative 16 can't be divided by 3, so I'm going to skip that. I'm going to go to 4. I could do 4 times negative 4, which adds together to be 0. So that is actually going to be the solution. So I'm going to put 4 and negative 4 into the sides. So there's 4 and there's a negative 4. And next up, we divide by our coefficient of a, right? We're going to divide by a. So a is just 1, so we're just going to take that 1 down. Neither of these reduce, right? So I'm going to leave them. So now we're going to write our binomials. Again, we're going bottoms up. So I have 1. It's going to be 1x, and we don't write coefficients of 1, so we're just going to write x plus 4, since that 4 is positive. And then I look at the other one, and again, I have bottoms up, and it's 1x, so it's just going to be x minus 4. And so that is now the factor of x squared minus 16. So this is the step factoring trinomials that you can use no matter what you are given. Go ahead and go over to some practice, and hopefully with more practice, it'll get easier for you. Have a nice day.